So we'll talk about developing the outsourcing strategy and how that could be developed. So it is always said that companies with a clear vision of their strategic and tactical objectives before entering into an outsourcing agreement have much better chance of succeeding and running that product in a much better way. So what does that also mean? It also means that laying out your objectives why you are outsourcing is very important. So let's talk a bit about why and how it can be helpful, the laying of the objectives. Because once those objectives are laid out and are in front of the company, the entire management team, they can easily communicate that with the team with whom they are going to outsource the project to. These objectives that are laid out could also be used as a base to set the agreement. Then is choosing the right staff augmentation model. Because once these objectives are laid out, life becomes much easy, I would say, so as to make sure that like what kind of model I want to go out with. If I've laid out that, okay, I need resources for X number of months, I can easily go with a time and material model. If I'm going to lay out my objective that I want to get a specific portion of my product to be built out, I can go with a fixed cost model. So these models we can easily figure out based on the objectives that are laid out. And eventually, it is always said that if you have something in writing and in front of you all the time, you tend to stick to it. So that is also equally important, I'd say. So while you are building the outsourcing strategy, another important thing is how do you assess these risks? So first is influence on the development strategy. This is kind of an fear mostly, because let's say you as a company, if you are outsourcing your core part of building the platform, this would be one risk, that do you really have the influence over the kind of development methodology they are going to use, or the kind of third parties they are going to use. So this could be one of the risks you can assess, that you should always have a say on what's going on, and all the approvals should go to you, go from you. Another thing is an unanticipated expenditure. Most of the time, it also happens that when a contract gets signed, there are some anticipations made during signing the contract that, okay, in this provider's package, there are this X number of services to be provided, and the contract is signed. But eventually, when the actual work starts, the provider can come back to you and say that, these are the services what we had agreed upon, but we also need these 2-3 more services, which are were not part of that initial deal. So these are kind of unanticipated expenditures. It is always good to assess this way before signing any of the contracts. Then the language barriers. Of course, when you are outsourcing the product development or your project development, it can be outsourced to many overseas countries. So language could be one of the barriers you have to think or assess way before time, because when you are working thousands of miles apart, your communication is the only thing that is going to keep a bridge between what you're expecting and what is going to be delivered. And then the time zone factors. You should also see that can the development team or the outsourced team actually overlaps a few hours of your time zone, because then it keeps your life also easy, so that if there are any blockers for the team, they can eventually get in touch with you and get them figured ASAP. So after looking at the assessing the risk, the next thing to do is defining the scope or the skills. So I want to emphasize on this part, which is clearly defining the scope of your project. There should not be any kind of assumptions to be made from either party, because you as a client, you shouldn't let the supplier team or the provider team decide or make assumptions that, okay, for example, I'm building a login, a project is supposed to build a login feature with Facebook, or it is written that, okay, social logins. there should be no room for any kind of a confusion later on that, okay, when I say social logins, the definition might be different for both the teams. For the client team, it might be all logins, all kind of social logins included in it. And for the provider team, it might be just the standard logins of Facebook, LinkedIn, or Google. So these are smaller things, but they really make a lot of difference when you define that entire scope. So that scope needs to be clearly defined if you're going with a fixed scope project. If you're going with a time and material where, let's say, the outsourced team is eventually going to work with your team or your dev team, so that time defining the skills, what you're looking for, is really important, because as this outsourced team is going to work hand in hand with your team, you should always look for those skills that complement to your developers. So eventually the end goal would be much bigger. And as I already said that like the scope definition should be so accurate that there should be no room for assumptions. Yeah. So now we are at a stage where, let's say, the objectives are defined. Then we also assess the risk, and now we have defined the scope. So what's next? So the next thing is defining the financial terms, which is very, very important, right? Because even if you saw in the case study, there were instances where the actual agreement and where that cost actually blew up to. So all of that could be avoided by defining the financial terms. So setting out the development budget and payment terms. This is actually helpful for both the teams, even for your provider and for you as a company when you're outsourcing. Because if you set out that development budget, you always make sure that you stick to that budget or around that budget. And there are no instances where a project needs to stop or something like that. And even deciding the payment terms is equally important. Then is defining the payment schedules. When do the payments go out? Like what are the terms against those? So defining that clearly into the contract, it actually saves a lot of headache at a later stage of time. And the third is set process around approval of cost overages. I've also seen this in like few of the instances where there is not a like a proper cost approval defined for a project. Let's say because usually this happens when a fixed cost project is going on and some additional features are to be built out. So the normal approach is for a provider to estimate it out, get back to the customer and tell that, okay, this would be the time and the cost required for it to get an approval and build it out. But I've seen with a few of my customers who had actually left their previous outsourced partners and then eventually working with us. So that time they had shared their experiences where the previous team actually started building out just based on the requirement without even informing what would be the cost and the time required for it. And then they bumped this all into the final invoice, and that really came out to be a surprise. So there should be a proper process that should be set from the company itself, I would say, so as to make sure nothing of this sort happens. Moving to the next part is again very critical, I would say, is appointing a single point of contact, or we call it SPOC. So how this helps is for a smoother communication. Again, because you might be having your management team sitting at one place. It could be a group of people. On the outsourced team side, there could be team members, 8 to 10 team members, and so on. So this communication has to go on, but usually it is always good to have a single point of contact at both the ends, and then they become responsible for communicating between the teams and also with their own team members. So that actually makes the communication much smoother. Also, it all helps for a fast exchange of information, because most of the times when you have a team which is really spread out throughout the world, and so that time, let's say, if there is not a single point of contact, then usually the conversations just get delayed because no one is responsible for, or no one is owning that conversation. With single point of contact, like that actually goes out, and there is a more faster exchange of information and even decisions. And of course, that will also help into eventually the project management at both the ends.